in the US and Canada have been drastically altered by human activities such as infrastructure development, logging, overgrazing, introduction of invasive species, and fire suppression. However, prior to Euro-American settlement, highly functional and biodiverse oak and or pine grassland systems dominated throughout much of the continent. With the current threat of climate change, as well as the relevancy of this topic, it's crucial to understand the past and present ecological conditions of these landscapes to inform future restoration efforts. Presenting with us today, ELA is happy and proud and thankful to introduce Heather Holm. Heather Holm is a biologist, pollinator, conservationist, and award-winning author. She passionately informs and educates audiences nationwide through her writing and many presentations about the fascinating world of native pollinators and beneficial insects and the native plant communities that support them. Heather is the author of 4 books: Pollinators of Native Plants, published 2014, Bees, 2017, Wasps, 2021, and Common Native Bees of the Eastern United States from 2022. Both Bees and Wasps have won multiple book awards, including the American Horticultural Society Book Award in 2018 and 2022, respectively. Heather's expertise includes the interactions between native pollinators and native plants and the natural history and biology of native bees and predatory wasps. Her work has been featured in the New York Times, Minneapolis Star-Tribune, and many local publications. Heather is also an accomplished photographer, and her pollinator photos are frequently featured in print and electronic publications. Before we jump into Heather's presentation, I would like to join everybody in saying goodbye to August and hello to September. We've got a couple of events that are coming up. Coming up September 8th, we have got our eco tour at Norcross Wildlife. Any questions about this, please feel free to send an email to any of our staff. September 12th, we will be having another webinar. That one will be titled Designing for Pollinators. These are currently posted on the website, so if you have any interest or further questions about these, feel free to look up our calendar on the ecolandscaping.org website. On September 14th, we'll be having our Mid-Atlantic meetup at Greenweaver Landscapes. Fantastic opportunity to get to meet your fellow ELA members and catch up with some people or meet some new ones. And then a little later in the month, we'll be having our webinar on the 19th, Native Plant Communities for Midwest Urban Gardens, and on the 23rd, another eco tour at Greenwood Cemetery. So that is all we've got for housekeeping. If anybody is, excuse me, sorry about that. If anybody sees my train of thought, please use the raise hand function. If anybody is seeking CEUs from this event, also, if you are looking to help us improve our future events, please do us a fantastic favor and fill out the SurveyMonkey, which the link for which is now in the chat, and will be posted in the chat throughout the presentation. So with that, I am happy to turn it over to Heather Holm. Heather, if you wouldn't mind sharing your presentation and taking it away for us.
Thanks, Aviva. Hi, everybody. Great to be here. And does that look okay, Aviva? All right. So thanks so much. And I'm actually looking forward to September. Aviva just mentioned that. It's been a hot and dry summer here. I'm in the Midwest in Minnesota. I realize if you are living in Michigan or eastward, you probably have had too much rain. So no normal or past normal occurs anymore. So most of my work focuses on pollinator habitat and pollinator conservation. But I spend about 50% of my time doing volunteer ecological restoration. And through that work, it really helps inform me what is viable pollinator habitat, learning to really read landscapes and understand their history and how and if they can be restored. And so this presentation is really a summary of what I have learned working through on ecological restorations. And today I'm going to be talking about a large part about fire. And fire is kind of a forgotten tool depending on where you live. It was a tool that was utilized by Native Americans and still is for land stewardship and other cultural practices. And it really largely influenced all of the ecoregions and what we as ecological practitioners think of as historical or perhaps current plant communities. And since Euro-American settlement, we all understand that there have been large-scale changes in the landscape. So I'm going to sort of start by looking into the past, talking about a few of those things, and then look forward with a warming climate. What does it mean to have fire suppression, and how can fire ecology be applied in a warming landscape in order to create more biodiverse landscapes? So I'm going to talk about the potential for landscapes to become more carbon or climate resilient. And I want to talk about the processes that have happened with large-scale fire suppression. So to give you some tools perhaps to help read a landscape and understand whether it did have some fire history and how fire could possibly be reintroduced into the landscape. So I'm going to talk about a number of things that are impacting a lot of these systems that we may be working in. Start by looking at the level 2 ecoregions. As I mentioned, I am based in Minnesota, and Minnesota has 3 converging ecoregions or biomes. So we have the northern boreal forest in the northeast. That green center section is a mix of prairie and forest tension zone, and then the light beige was historically prairie. So we're sort of on that western edge of the eastern deciduous forest. And with climate modeling, and you can probably find similar mapping for the state or province that you live in, Minnesota is destined to have a climate by 2070 similar to that of Kansas. So we are trending hotter and drier. And what does that mean for our current plant communities, our historical plant communities, and going forward, how do we restore these systems? So this is just a close-up look of the state of Minnesota and those 3 biomes. As I mentioned, that tension zone or that middle zone is often characterized as the eastern broadleaf forest or deciduous forest or woodland. But it really was this patchwork of prairie, savanna, open oak woodlands, and not necessarily what we would consider a closed canopy forest. And then to the north and northeast, we had boreal forest. And how this map was created, we call this the Marshner map in Minnesota. And a cartographer, Francis Marshner, who never actually came to Minnesota, he was based in Washington, D.C., he actually pored over all of the land surveyor notebooks, noting the bearing or witness trees that were noted at both the intersections of transects and along the transects. And from that information, and also from how the land surveyors characterized the landscape, he was able to reproduce this map, which is titled The Original Vegetation of Minnesota. But of course, we all know that this map was just characterizing a single point in time, somewhere between 1848 and around 1900 here in the state of Minnesota. And by that time, of course, many changes had already occurred. A lot of European settlement had happened, a lot of conversion of landscapes, the start of fire suppression. So this map is just a tool that can be used, but not something that may be, the Bible as far as we consider of plant communities. And with the warming climate, this tension zone or these 3 biomes shifted over time, over thousands and thousands of years, post-glaciation. And many things obviously are influencing these different plant communities: the climate, the geology, the soil type, the topography. You had very different plant communities growing on north or east facing cool slopes versus what plant communities would occur on south or west facing slopes. And then the other part that we often forget about is the cultural and biological influences or factors. And that included the historic use of fire by Native Americans, or fire that was naturally set by lightning. And in addition, the large grazing mammals that were keeping these landscapes open and flower diverse. This is just a drill down to look at the county that I live in. I live in the West Metro of the Twin Cities, and you can see from a county level change how much landscape loss of natural habitat has occurred. And so the left image is from the Marshner map of the pre-settlement, and then you can see on that right image, you can barely make out these little colored fragments that remain of the original pre-European landscape. And fire exclusion really was the main driver of a lot of this change initially. Native American population changes with the introduction of infectious diseases, wars, signing of treaties and ceding of their ancestral lands, and then large-scale European settlement of the area. And Europeans brought with them grazing cattle, which were very different large mammals, and in their behavior and how they influenced plant communities, and how Europeans thought of the landscape and use of cattle and grazing animals. It was very different from the grazing animals such as bison and elk that were largely extirpated. And then we've had, of course, conversion of natural landscapes for everything else: agriculture, housing, commercial buildings, roads, etc. And then since the 1930s, post the 1930s drought, we've had an increase in rainfall up until relatively recently, where we are now back into a drought situation. What has occurred in a lot of these prairie and also tension zone landscapes here in the Midwest is something called the mesophication of oak ecosystems, or the afforestation of these systems. And it's not just occurring here, it's occurring throughout the eastern North America. And that's what I'll be talking about a little bit more today, to highlight what has happened to the remaining fragments and the reforesting of these spaces that are no longer used for agriculture. And here, this has really resulted in an increase in invasibility of these sites. So I'm going to show you some examples. But to first, this is really how I view the landscape. I think of this as a continuum, and this is based on the Tallgrass Restoration Handbook. And we often talk about forest succession, and forest succession is really a process that does not involve fire. And these 3 out of 4 sort of primary ecosystems are fire maintained and have been historically maintained. So prairie, a very open landscape, would be maintained with relative high frequency of fire. Savanna is a prairie with scattered trees essentially, and it would be maintained with relative frequency of fire. And then an open woodland is still a treed landscape. But again, look at this graphic. All of these 3 systems that are fire maintained have a diverse ground layer vegetation. And this is really what is making up the most of the plant diversity within these 3 systems. And then a forest is largely on landscapes historically that would have escaped fire in floodplains, on cool north-facing slopes. These closed canopy systems don't have the herbaceous ground layer diversity that these other 3 fire-maintained systems do. And it's really these landscape fire relationships and fire frequency that would often determine what plant community occurred where, and even at a local scale. So 100+ fire interval, that would result in a landscape succeeding into a closed canopy forest, dominated perhaps, depending on where you live, by species such as maple or American beech. And these species are considered pyrophobic or mesophytic, meaning they are fire sensitive. A 10 to 20 year fire interval on landscapes would have allowed some fire tolerant trees to establish, such as oak, hickory, or pine. And with that frequency, these trees would grow, but it would still be this open habitat with largely a prairie-like understory. And then a 2-year fire interval, there's really very few, or if any, woody plants that are able to sustain or grow within frequencies such as 2 years. And so that's largely maintaining these open prairie or meadow systems dominated by various types of grasses, sedges, and flowering plants. This is a book I highly recommend if you want to learn more about the historical use of fire. This was written by Omer Stewart, and at the time, I believe it was in the 30s that he started writing this book. There was really no interest by book publishers to publish something about Native Americans at that time. It was recently sort of picked up, an editorial and introductions were included, and it finally has become a published work. And within that, Omer Stewart really goes area by area throughout the country. So he looks at the Northeast and the Mid-Atlantic and the Southeast and all the way to the West. And he highlights historical accounts, not only by earlier European explorers, how they would maybe write in a notebook or describe the landscape that they first witnessed, followed by settlers. He also looked at analysis of tree fire scars. So when large trees were felled, researchers can determine the years and dates and fire frequency based on the scars within the tree. And he really highlights and documents that there were large-scale, high-frequency fires throughout much of the US and parts of southern Canada. And so this really turns the idea on its head that when the first European explorers arrived on this continent, that perhaps the eastern seaboard, for example, was a closed canopy forest. That is not the case whatsoever. Given these historical counts and also climate modeling and fire frequency modeling that is showing that there were fires occurring so frequently that there just would be no way that the whole eastern US would be a closed canopy forest. And what fire did, it created these and maintained these more open habitats, sometimes treed, sometimes just grasslands, fire intolerant trees dominating. And these, what the settlers and early explorers described as park-like plant communities. So scattered trees with large-scale views through the understory and dense ground layer vegetation. And here's a map that models the fire frequency throughout the US. Another book I recommend is The Forgotten Grasslands of the South by Reed Noss. And so if you are tuning in from anywhere from Virginia southward, he really details all of the grasslands that used to occur and some that still occur in the South, and also talks about the relative high frequency of fire. Now in the Southeast, that is an example that historically many of those fires were not human lit. They would have been lit by lightning or other natural ways. But take a look at this map. The dark pink or blue areas are where there's anywhere from a 50 to over 100-year fire frequency. So those are high altitude, up on mountains, on steep slopes where fire would not have been able to run through. But if you look at primarily the whole eastern US and the Midwest, and it's red hot in some areas, the bright red, going down to yellows and greens, those all represent anywhere from a 2 to 20-year fire frequency. And a 2 to 20-year fire frequency is maintaining either open grasslands or these savanna systems. And here's just another map by a more recent research paper by Bryce Hanbury and colleagues. And she looked at the breakdown of some of these systems. So fire historically used to maintain either oak dominated, oak hickory dominated, or oak or pine dominated systems. These are all tree genera that are insensitive or fire tolerant trees. And so these systems dominated much of the eastern US. The southeastern pine savannas, the longleaf pine, very few of those remain because many have either been logged or turned into closed canopy forests. The shortleaf pine, oak, sort of combo platter north of the southeastern area also were open grown pines and oaks mixing together with diverse ground layer vegetation. And then as you travel further north, you have oak systems, including oak savannas, oak woodlands, and oak hickory mixed open habitat. Back to Minnesota, this is an interesting sort of look at the Marshner map. Researchers back in 2016 took a second look at all of those surveyor notes and the bearing trees noted, and then they remapped the state here where I live, noting how many of the bearing trees or what percentage were pyrophilic, meaning tolerant of fire. So the more red areas on the map and yellow areas, there was a predominance of fire tolerant trees throughout the state of Minnesota. The three areas that they highlight, number 2 and 3 and the one up in the north, were low-lying areas, large wetland systems that were remnants of glacial lakes. So they're more boreal and so wet that fire was unable to spread through there. So this is, I think, a really interesting research paper just to re-examine, and this could be done for a number of states, and I believe these authors have also looked at Illinois, Wisconsin, and some of the other Great Lakes and Midwestern states. So to break down just generally the pyrophilic or pyrophobic trees and where they occur, the oaks and hickories, hawthorn and aspen tend to be more fire tolerant. The oaks would be dominating in these systems called oak savanna or oak woodland, and the pines would occur in plant communities characterized as pine barrens or pine savannas. And then the fire intolerant trees include many of our deciduous trees that occur in closed canopy forests and floodplain forests. So the maples, the birch, the hackberry, cottonwoods and elms and basswoods, for example. And then the evergreens, the firs, cedars, spruce, and hemlock are occurring in boreal forests. So these are just trees that I pulled out from the Bearing Tree Study in Minnesota, but many of them also occur in other plant communities throughout the East. So why Native Americans set the landscape on fire, and what were some of the reasons? Of course, I am not from that community, so I'm not going to pretend to understand or speak on their behalf, but some of the generally accepted reasons include that they were maintaining these open grassland systems because it would provide nutritious forage for some of their primary game, such as bison that they were hunting. And burned grasslands produce fresh new growth that is really high in protein and phosphorus, really important nutrients for these grazing animals, particularly in the spring when they are getting ready to calve. And the American bison, people often think of this grazing animal being a Midwestern animal. The map on the left was created in 1876 in a book called The American Bisons, Living and Extinct. And hopefully you can see the blue parts, but the blue parts are the pre-1800 range. And then as Europeans arrived and started hunting these animals and driving them out of the eastern US, and slowly their range kept contracting and contracting until, of course, we all know the story, very few remained until, other than some that were kept on farms, that we are still using as a population to repopulate bison in various national parks and reintroduce them for restoration use. A similar map was created by Bryce Hanbury and colleagues, and you can see the extent of the range into the eastern US. The eastern woodland bison occurred throughout much of the eastern US and would have been grazing these grassland-like understories of these open tree systems that were fire maintained. Fire also promoted the abundant production of fruit and seed, which were perhaps primary forage plants and cultural plants of importance for Native Americans. So they knew and understand that lighting fires and having fires carry through these understories would produce heavier fruit sets and heavier seed sets. And then, of course, there were also aesthetic and cultural reasons that fire helped their living. They were able to have these understories to travel through that didn't have dense underbrush. Fire helped reduce tick populations and perhaps drove out unwanted reptiles or amphibians. And fires also really allowed them to hunt and forage more easily, having these sight lines through the landscape. Now, the oak systems that occur here in the Midwest are really fascinating to me. Here where I live right smack in the middle of the edge of the tension zone. To the west of me was historically prairie, but I live in more of a treed landscape dominated by oak trees. And so that dark area that runs through the section of Minnesota down into Wisconsin is really representative of the tallgrass, savanna, and woodland mix or tension zone. And these are prairies are often characterized as the most sort of rare plant communities. Here in Minnesota, we had over 18 million acres of prairie, that whole south and western section of the state. And now we have less than 1% of original prairie. But many people don't know that these oak savannas are even more rare. 50 million acres of oak savanna occurred throughout the Midwest, and only 0.06% remains today. So these were highly attractive places for Europeans to settle. These open grassland landscapes that were easy to graze their European cattle or easy to till. It was quite attractive for them, likely to harvest the oak timber that occurred in these savannas. So these are now one of the most world's endangered ecosystems. Very few living examples of oak savannas remain in the temperate zone. And so we are really looking at where they historically occurred and how we can reconstruct or save some of these remaining fragments of oak savanna. Fire, it influenced the prevalence of different types of trees, those that, of course, that were more fire tolerant, including the oak and pine, depending on what area you lived in. And these trees have a number of traits that'll really allow them to withstand frequent fires. So these are just some traits of oaks that I have on the slide. The leaf litter is highly flammable. So oak leaf litter is thick. It dries quickly and it curls, and so when it drops on the ground, it creates these air pockets, and it actually helps facilitate and carry fire through the landscape. The oak trees themselves have very thick bark, and that thick bark, once they become mature, enables them to withstand the heat of the fire. They also, if they're younger oaks and they get burned and top killed, they have large tap roots that enable them to regrow and regenerate new leaders. They also have the ability to close wounds rapidly. And oaks are very, very long lived and have a very slow growth rate. So they are also very, very drought tolerant. So again, here in the Midwest, we are trending hotter and drier, and we have some of these iconic large oak trees that once grew in open savanna habitat that are barely hanging on because of various factors. And we know that they are drought tolerant. And so this is why there is an emphasis here in the Midwest to focus on their plant communities in which they thrive in. We all are familiar, I think, with Doug Tallamy's work in his most recent book, The Nature of Oaks. But in addition to oaks having all of these wonderful traits, Doug Tallamy will tell you they are one of the top keystone species for over 80% of the counties throughout the US. And I think this is also a symptom of the history of fire ecology throughout the US, sort of a strong selective pressure that has resulted in oak dominance in so many counties throughout the US. And as a keystone species, it means that they are a species that many other organisms within a food web depend on. So Doug Tallamy's work, of course, highlights that oak trees serve up hundreds of different species of butterfly and moth caterpillars, which help sustain songbird populations and really help to form a diverse food web. And the structure of oaks, they have a more open canopy. They tend to have broad branching, outward branching habit. It also facilitates this highly diverse ground layer vegetation beneath. And I just did a back of the envelope calculation, switching over to pollinator habitat. And more than 93% of the host plants, so native bees actually have keystone host plants, which are different than the ones that Doug Tallamy talks about for butterfly and moth caterpillars. But a number of native bee species specialize on collecting a very specific type of pollen from a specific type of plant. And 93% of those host plants, those native host plants that they depend on, occur in these more open grassland fire-dependent systems. This is just a quick slide to highlight bee oligolecty or bee specialization on native plants. There's really a broad spectrum. In a bee that is not a specialist is often characterized as a generalist, but some of the narrow specialists, such as the narrow oligolectic bees, would be females that would be collecting pollen from just one plant genus. So the Andrena integra bee that I have on the bottom right of this slide, she specializes on collecting just pollen from dogwood or the genus Cornus. And then the spectrum or the range sort of broadens, and some bees will specialize on a specific plant family, and then others, based on their often sociality, will not be specialists. They'll be foraging throughout the growing season based on that long colony cycle. So they're visiting a wide variety of different plant families. Here is a quick slide to show you some of those, or all of the genera in Minnesota that bees specialize on. And as you can see, as I mentioned earlier, they all or most of them occur in these fire-dependent systems, either grasslands or open woodlands. Very few, one erythronium, the trout lily, tends to occur in closed canopy forested systems. All right, so to go back and define these sort of 4 ecosystems within this continuum, prairie is easy. If you're in the east, sometimes open grassland systems are called meadows, but these are basically landscapes that would have maybe no more than 1 tree per acre. They're open, they're dominated by various types of grasses, sedges, and flowering plants. And then a savanna has anywhere from 5 to 50% tree cover. And usually savannas have clusters of trees and then maybe a single tree. So it's not a scattered, a uniform scattering of trees throughout the landscape. But these savannas are still able to support prairie species, but also some more woodland species. And more than 80% of the total plant diversity within these systems occurs in the ground layer vegetation. And then a woodland is still a grassland system or fire-dependent system, and it has a tree canopy cover typically of 50 to 70%. So you're still getting some pockets of light opening that is maintaining a diverse herbaceous ground layer vegetation. It is dominated by fire tolerant or trees such as oak, hickory, aspen, hawthorn, and plum. And some kind of fire frequency anywhere from 15 to 30 years would maintain these more open woodland systems. And then we have the closed canopy forest, which often when they do follow the succession process, turn into a climax forest dominated by very few tree species. That photo in the bottom right is of a sugar maple basswood closed canopy forest community in Minnesota, and you can see the sugar maple is very dominant within that climax system. And so these trees, the ones that are fire intolerant, that can't get a foothold in landscapes that are regularly maintained with fire, would occur in these closed canopy systems. And if we look at this continuum or spectrum from a number of different other factors, of course, tree species diversity can be highest in the forested systems, and also obviously the canopy cover is high. We've got the asterisks there because I just talked about how when they reach their climax state, they do become lower in tree diversity. And then when you have some of the highest herbaceous plant diversity, of course, starting on the left side of this continuum, decreasing as you go to the right, and the bee diversity sort of follows that trend. And then if you look at functionality, and this is really what I am looking at from the perspective of climate change resiliency. How functional and stable are these systems? Well, these three systems on the left are highly functional and highly stable if they are maintained with fire. If they are not maintained with fire, then that is not the case whatsoever. And then what about climate change resiliency? So how resilient is a closed canopy forest system here where I live, for example? So these are some of the questions that I have constantly rolling around in my mind, thinking about how can we start to work on some large-scale conversions of some of these systems to help prepare them and make them more resilient to climate change. This is modeling done from the University of Minnesota Forest Ecology. And so this is kind of, they've done a number of models. This is the middle model. They call it the warmer model of +8 degrees centigrade of warming. And you can see the dark red area of our state. The prairie is pushing in from the western states and covering a good portion of Minnesota. The conifer forest has largely disappeared, so that boreal forest in the northeast, it's too hot. And this is by 2070, so that conifer forest has been pushing up into northern Ontario. And then what was the boreal or conifer forest is going to turn into a broadleaf forest. And this is sort of a warmer model, and I think we're actually on the hot model at this point, the business as usual model, as the researchers call it. So the other processes that I really want to highlight, and this applies to all areas in the eastern US, is what has happened since Euro-American settlement and large-scale fire suppression or fire exclusion. If you live on the East Coast, you've had many more years than me in the Midwest of fire suppression in many cases. So maybe an additional 100 years of fire suppression. And what has happened here in the Midwest and much of the eastern US is these open habitats have radically been changed and with fire suppression. So what has happened is these closed canopy fire intolerant species from the forested and floodplain systems have started invading what was once a more open habitat. And this process is called the mesophication or afforestation of these fire-dependent systems. And this term was first coined in 2008 by Greg Nowacki and colleagues on this study that they titled The Demise of Fire and Mesophication of Forests in the Eastern US. This graphic is from that study. And really what it's showing is that pre-1900 settlement on the graphic on the left that is more open, a mix of oak and pine perhaps. And then as fire suppression occurs, then you start to have some of these fire intolerant trees seeding into this landscape. And then fast forward by the early 2000s, you've got a dominant understory and perhaps overstory of a mix, or what I maybe call a hodgepodge of both fire intolerant and fire tolerant trees. And right at that point where we have this mix, especially here in the Midwest, and I believe this is true for much of the eastern US, that has created cooler, moister conditions. And for some of our most tenacious invasive plants, such as European buckthorn, it's really put out a welcome mat and said, hey, we're creating the conditions that you love by having these more open systems changed by invasion of fire intolerant trees. And this graphic is also from that study, and I like this idea of a tipping point, especially from the perspective of ecological restoration. So if you follow along the upper left and bottom left graphics, that is a more mesic or medium moisture system, and you can see the balls with fire roll back and forth into those troughs. It's a stable system as long as fire is being applied to the landscape. But when you take fire out of the landscape, so the bottom left, those balls just start rolling down, and eventually you reach this tipping point and the ball rolls down into what the authors call the abyss. And I think a lot of us are in the abyss, depending on what kind of ecological restoration we may be doing. And we may not understand all of the things or all the things it will take to get that ball rolled up over the top of that tipping point. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the failed efforts here that have occurred and why we need to really think about reintroducing fire on the landscape. So this fire exclusion leads to this proliferation of fire intolerant or pyrophobic trees, and it really results in this massive shift in tree composition. This massive shift in tree composition is even reflected in some of the plant community descriptions that I've seen for various states. And so it's kind of confusing, because if you use those plant community descriptions as a guide to restore an area to a certain plant community, you may not be looking at that from a fire ecology standpoint. So here is the abyss on the left. As I mentioned, our primary forest and woodland invader is European buckthorn. This picture was taken in late fall, and buckthorn holds its leaves much longer than the native trees. This was once an oak savanna. So the large tree in the middle of that image would have been open growing, but what has happened is elms and basswood and ash trees have invaded that open habitat with fire suppression. They've created more cool, shaded conditions, the perfect conditions that buckthorn loves. And then buckthorn has moved in and completely invaded the understory. So this is a really dysfunctional system, low pollinator diversity, no oak regeneration whatsoever. So all of these oak trees require light in order to regenerate. An acorn may germinate in a forest, but it will never become an oak tree, because oaks don't grow in forests. And it's also sort of a positive or self-reinforcing feedback loop. The system remains highly invasible, and it's going to be really difficult to control the buckthorn because of these changes that have occurred from fire suppression. And then if you compare that with the right image, this is a fire maintained system. You have healthy oak trees that are open grown. You have a high diversity of herbaceous ground layer vegetation. If an acorn falls from one of those oak trees, it will germinate likely and maybe become a oak tree. So you have different age classes and oak regeneration occurring. And you also have a more climate resilient landscape due to its biodiversity. So take a look at any forest anywhere in the eastern US, and really, if you start to parse out what are the fire tolerant and fire intolerant species, this is a perfect example of what I call the hodgepodge. So you can see through shading and invasion of trees and invasive plants, no longer does any diverse ground layer vegetation occur in this picture. The orange markers are marking fairly old oak trees that once grew in a more open habitat. So even though they don't look very big, they would be close to 150 to 180-year-old bur oak trees. And then what has happened with fire suppression is all of these young mesophytic trees have seeded into this landscape and are starting to completely shade out any remaining understory. And this really does put out the welcome mat for invasive plants. Now, the management that has happened in this picture is that dark green plant you can see sort of regenerating on the ground layer is that European buckthorn. And the person managing this landscape has cut it multiple times, has treated it with herbicide, is just focusing on the invasive plant rather than looking at what is the problem with the whole system. And the problem with the whole system here is that you have dying oaks, you have no oak regeneration, and you've had large-scale invasion by fire-intolerant trees. The fire-intolerant trees also have a number of traits to suppress fire, which is not a surprise whatsoever. So if you think of maples or American beech, they have dense crowns, and that results in heavy shading of the woodland understory. So really, those systems and plant diversity are highlighted in the spring when you have ephemerals coming up from the leaf litter, blooming for that very short time before the leaves come out on the tree canopies, and then they largely disappear. And you also have moisture conditions because it's more shaded. And these trees also have a mechanism to help capture water that I'll talk about. And the overall light reduction has really largely eliminated any grass or diverse ground layer vegetation in this system. The way that these often these mesophytic trees capture water, many of them have smooth bark. And when it rains, the water actually flows down the trunk, something called stem flow, and then it pools and captures water around the base of the tree. So this, in a sense, is helping the tree to withstand if the landscape were to have fire run through it, and it's helping to suppress fire. So if you go back to that picture I just showed you of the basswood trees invading an oak system, those basswood trees are creating these moist zones of influence at their base. So even if you tried to run a fire through that landscape, those trees would be helping to suppress the effectiveness of that fire. And then the leaf litter. So the mesophytic trees do not have leaf litter that can carry a fire. And by design, because these trees are fire sensitive. So if you think of maple leaf litter, it's very thin and it falls to the ground and it doesn't dry and curl up. It kind of mats and it remains moist. It also decomposes rapidly. Here in the Midwest, we have a number of different invasive worms, and they are voracious consumers of the mesophytic leaf litter. So in a lot of these closed canopy systems, by midsummer, if we have a huge European earthworm population, we have basically bare dirt under these closed canopy forests. And I talked earlier about the adaptations of oak leaf litter in comparison, how they are thick and they curl and they actually help facilitate carrying the fire through the landscape. Okay, so to summarize, mesophication is not just happening in oak ecosystems, it's happening in all of these fire-dependent systems I talked about, including pine systems. And so what we think of as healthy forested landscapes may not actually be the case. And I am really looking at, in order to have high plant diversity, we have to start thinking about how can we manage these systems to more open habitat and not closed canopy forests. So the shaded, cool conditions promote more mesophytic trees with the absence of fire. And this really leads to the further decline of these, in some cases, very rare systems. So going forward, we need to identify where these remnant systems still remain, preserve, restore, and reconstruct the grasslands. It's often the ground layer that disappears first in these systems, followed by the invasion of various invasive plants and fire-intolerant trees. And so really what needs to happen is the harvesting of some of these mesophytic trees, reestablishing fire, obviously removing invasive plants at the same time. And then if you don't have any natural seed bank or plants occurring on the ground layer, then you would need to source local seed sources to start establishing the herbaceous vegetation. So this is one project I'm working on that's a 13-acre oak savanna restoration. And though this in the tension zone here in the Midwest, this is what was an oak savanna. This is what they look like. So in the middle of this image is a 240-year-old plus white oak tree. It was once open growing, so you can see it had some lower branches that are now dead, and that is a symptom that it used to have these long horizontal branches that would stretch out and were formerly growing in an open system. And then all of that green mess surrounding and suffocating this oak tree is European buckthorn. And in addition to that, on this site, a lot of different fire-intolerant trees have invaded the system. So this is a city property, and I serve on a nonprofit that is helping fund and facilitate the restoration of this site. We acquired $90,000 in county and state funding and hired local contractors to start some of these steps to reverse this decline of this oak savanna. This machine is called the Feller Buncher, and some of our folks that live in northern Minnesota that were formerly employed in the timber industry are using some of the same equipment now for ecological restoration. So it's got this big carbide spinning blade at the base, if you look closely on the photo, and then grappling arms. And on frozen ground in the winter, the contractor drove around and covered 13 acres in 1 week, harvesting all of the invasive buckthorn and many of the mesophytic trees from the system. This is just after the harvesting occurred on frozen ground. So you can see a lot of these old oak trees have now been liberated from competition. They will now have more light. They will now be able to reproduce in this more open habitat. Follow-up steps have included more invasive plant management on the ground. We are running a prescribed fire through this site this fall, and then following the prescribed fire, we'll be putting down all of the prairie and savanna vegetation to reestablish that ground layer. So really, I think a great model for many of the places that we live is this bi-layered or two-layered system. And that is an open canopy of overstory trees, predominantly fire tolerant, and then a diverse herbaceous understory. And that diverse herbaceous understory is what is boosting up overall plant diversity and really forming that critical foundation to support all the other organisms in the food web. And in order to do so, these systems have to be more open. More light needs to penetrate the ground in order to be able to support this diverse herbaceous understory. And once you do so, you can reintroduce fire, because this herbaceous understory really becomes your fuel. It's not the leaf litter, it's having dense understory that helps carry the fire over time. And once this understory establishes, you are now helping to limit soil erosion. The deep-rooted native plants that are growing in there are helping to sequester carbon and hopefully permanently sequestering that into the soil and really making these systems more resilient to climate change. So as ecological land stewards, I highlighted a little bit about the historical role that Native American and First Nations people had on land stewardship through their use of cultural fire. And I really think it's important that as ecological practitioners, we continue to forge partnerships to better develop an appreciation and understanding of the cultural use of fire and how that has really largely influenced the landscapes where we live, and to find also opportunities through these partnerships and conversations to initiate inclusion, understanding, and reconciliation. So I'm going to leave you with two quotes. The myth of the forest is a quote from a Midwestern forest ecologist, and the one on the left in the green box is by Dwayne Estes and colleagues, and they run the Southeastern Grassland Initiative. So they're trying to save some of the last open grassland systems in the Southeast. Both of these quotes highlight that the idea of the forest may be a dangerous idea going forward, and that we need to unhitch our wagon from this colonial, hundreds of years of colonial fire suppression, and start thinking differently about how we manage the landscapes. So thanks so much for tuning in. And Aviva, if we have time for questions, I'd be happy to answer some.
Well, fantastic. We do indeed have time for questions. Heather, if you've got an extra 5 minutes of your Wednesday evening, we can go for a full 10 minutes into about 7:05.
That's fine.
We've got a bunch of questions straight off of the bat. I'm going to go ahead and start with chat questions. In between, anybody is free to raise a hand or come off of mute. And if you're worried your question won't be gotten to, we will be saving all of the questions from the chat and forwarding those along to Heather so we can get you guys answers. So the first question that I have got in the chat is, can you get map fires history showing New Jersey, and you do not show the New Jersey Highlands, only Pine Barrens? Why?
Oh, I was just highlighting a few examples of fire dependent systems, and New Jersey is a wonderful history and plant communities. So if you're in New Jersey, you would know more than I would about all of the detailed plant communities. But I think a lot of the sort of bearing tree mapping state by state, as I mentioned, is occurring. And those researchers are with the US Forest Service. So they are really looking through a lens of fire ecology in a lot of the eastern US. So if you can't find it, I would reach out to Greg Nowacki. He's one of the authors that I mentioned a couple of times, and he may be able to provide you with more information.
Great. Our next question is, if bison did not live in New England, do you think that the ground layer was not grassy?
Well, in New England, I would imagine that you still had elk populations and other large mammals that were doing similar type of grazing, and not just in the grazing, but because they are large animals, they would be pushing over small vegetation and keeping the habitat more open. So again, I can't think of the historical range of elk off the top of my head, but they did range fairly far south throughout the eastern US historically.
So here's a question from the same person about the same place. How prevalent would maple and birch have been in New England, where fires occurred every 18 years or so?
Not at all. I mean, there would have been pockets of maple. Birch is a little more fire tolerant than maple, surprisingly. But the maples, the sugar maples would have been eking out an existence on cool north-facing slopes where fire wasn't able to travel through. Red maple would have been in more low-lying areas near wetlands and would have escaped fire. So maples would have been present, but not in what we think of as the second growth forests of today of New England. So where I grew up in Ontario, and the predominant plant community there was a sugar maple basswood forest. But given that it was around the Great Lakes, that was over 300 years of colonization and fire suppression. So what I perceived as, the nature or plant community where I grew up was really a result of 300 years of fire suppression, and the landscape may have been much more open at the time prior to European settlement. And that may have been the case in a lot of the Northeast as well. So we have to be careful. I guess my message is we have to be careful using what we think are current plant community models on the landscape, because they may be sort of short-term, a couple 100-year models versus thousands of years type of model.
Great. Our next question was, how are you defining functionality on the previous graph? And that looks like it's the graph about halfway through.
Yeah, so functionality really is what I meant by that is how well it's supporting interactions within the food web, how stable it is. And so that's really what I was trying to say about, and I think I kind of glossed over that, but it's functional because it is creating a functional system for many other organisms to thrive, right? And I was comparing that to closed canopy, where yes, we have a lot of different species, birds, mammals that rely on closed canopy systems, but many of the bird species, insect species that are in decline were largely associated with more open grassland systems. So just to keep that in mind, and I didn't talk about breaking down different declines of different wildlife groups.
This next question says, you mentioned that oaks don't regenerate in a forest. Did I hear this correctly? Why would this be? Perhaps shade intolerant?
Yes, they're shade intolerant. So the red oak group, which can include red oak, black oak, northern pin oak, just as some examples, the pointed leaved oaks, they're a little more shade tolerant, and they can actually be invaders. But they tend to show up on the edges of forested systems and then work their way within and mix in with closed canopy forests in some cases. But the white oak group that are more open grown, they are completely shade intolerant. And so they are unable to regenerate in those closed canopy forests. And that's sort of one of the problems I would say here is we have what I call iconic but geriatric oaks in what area I live in now. And we have absolutely no oak regeneration occurring because of the invasion of trees and invasive plants. So that's a real problem from a resiliency standpoint.
Awesome. Our next genuine question is going to be, how large is your oak savanna project? 13 acres?
Yeah, the whole property is 30 acres. We're not converting it all to an oak savanna. So again, how topography is influencing the plant communities. We are reestablishing the oak savanna on south and west facing slopes and the tops of knolls. But we do have low-lying, more mesic, wet forest in the north part of the property. And we have adjoining suburban homeowners. So we will be having or providing a model for various plant communities to showcase to the public once that opens. It's currently closed to the public for now.
Go ahead and come off of mute to ask your question, Janie.
How is that being funded for the future?
Good question. Good question. So we had $90,000 just to get 2 years of initial restoration work happening. But as we all know, restoration needs continuous funding and management. The funding really just kickstarted some of those really major steps, but it is a city-owned property. We, as the nonprofit associated with that property, do intend to apply for more grants because there will be a lot of more money needed to restore the other areas of the site and also to continue that area under current restoration on a positive trajectory.
I live in Boston, but behind me is Aravaca in Arizona, southern Arizona, and it must have 40 species of oak in there.
Yep. And then, Arizona is a great example of different oak species and fire tolerant species mixing together. And once you sort of learn the plant genera, you can travel and see, what I talked about earlier, reading the landscape. You can see that fire ecology history in a lot of these places.
All right, so we've only got a couple minutes left, so apologies if I end up skipping over anybody's questions, but again, we will be opening avenues of contact for you to be able to get all of your questions and comments responded to. Next question is going to be, did you have to seed the herbaceous understory or rely on an existing seed bank?
A little bit of both for that project. We did have a pretty decent herbaceous understory, a lot of different sedges and some woodland grasses that are hopefully going to help provide the fuel. What we did do though, post-harvesting, is we did seed half our allotment of grasses in order to cover any bare gaps in the understory to establish a little bit more fuel so that when we do a prescribed burn this fall, we have enough fuel to carry through the landscape. So what is really nice about your initial prescribed fire, it's the opportune time to put that native seed down on the temporary bare ground, and you're getting excellent seed soil contact. We're typically doing these initial burns in the fall here in the Midwest, and then those seeds are going into cold stratification and readily germinate the following year. So it's a nice kind of setup if you do get a prescribed burn on the landscape.
Great. One last question before we send you guys to click on that SurveyMonkey link and continue on with the rest of what I hope to be a fantastic week, excuse me. So anyways, our last question is going to be wondering if invasive jumping worm controlled by changes to forest management practices that include prescribed burns.
Yeah, you cut out just for a second, Aviva. So I heard jumping worms. Maybe just
Sorry.
no problem.
Invasive jumping worm populations can be controlled by changes to forest management practices that include burns.
Yes, as far as I understand, that is the case. And the same with European earthworms. They're less prevalent in grassland systems because they're hotter and drier. And if you're burning it with relative frequency, you're taking away their primary food source, which is plant debris and leaf litter. Jumping worms are a fairly new thing here in Minnesota, but I understand that they live in very shallow couple of inches of the soil. So I'm just guessing, someone can throw in the correct answer, but I'm guessing that they would not thrive in hot grassland systems either that are burned with regular frequency. So it's kind of like a lot of these invasive plants or organisms, maybe we can, get a leg up on them in a sense if we alter the ecosystem in which they thrive in their native continent. So a better understanding of where they're coming from and why they're really good at invading some of these systems here in the US.
All right, Heather, thank you so much for that fantastic presentation, for those fantastic answers to those questions. Everybody, if you check the chat, you'll see a link from myself and Mads for the SurveyMonkey. Your survey responses not only help you earn CEs, but also help us to improve the webinar and learning experience for you so that next time we have Heather back can be even more engaging, even better. All of our comments are saying huge thank yous and compliments to you, Heather, and I can only echo them in kind. And thank you all for joining us. Hopefully we'll see a few of you in person on the 8th for the Eco Tour at Norcross Wildlife. If not, our next webinar, Designing for Pollinators, will be September 12th, and we look forward to seeing you all there. Thank you so much for joining us today, and enjoy the rest of your weeks or winks.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.